And so, like I
That
said,
doesn't happen.
Eric's doing a wonderful job here in Los Angeles, and also I think opening up this profession to the diversity of students that are here locally in this region, and which is a really important thing and relevant to the context of the presentation tonight. Without further ado, I want to welcome Eric for his talk on income inequality, racial segregation, and urban avifauna, the tale of Los Angeles.
All right, thanks, Travis. Let me share my screen, and I hope that doesn't happen, whatever that was, with I don't know if that was my connection or what, but if I blip out, I'm on campus at Cal State LA, so the network should be kind of firing on all cylinders. So hopefully that was just who knows what blip. Well, thank you all for being here, and definitely thank you, Travis. Everything you were saying sounded so good, and then it blipped out, and I was like, oh, I wonder what he's saying. But I got it all there, and just a little bit more about me, and just kind of building off of the really nice things that Travis was saying. I've been in my position now for, I guess, 6 years. I always kind of lose track about how long it's been. And I'm a trained avian ecologist. I've been studying birds for well over 20 years, doing field research and all over the place, all over different parts of the world. And when I took the job here at Cal State LA, I definitely had an interest in continuing ornithological research in Southern California and some of the other field sites I had in various other parts of the country. But one of the things I was super excited about was to build an urban ecological research program. And the reasons why I was so excited about that, and I hope this comes across in this presentation today, is because I'm very much an applied ecologist. And so what that means, and Travis was getting at this, is that really just about every single thing that I do, it's meant to have some type of conservation outcome. And when thinking about urban systems, when you're doing something like, say, studying street trees and how they're important to birds, if there is some type of conservation outcome from that, like planting trees in places where there aren't, that usually also has a benefit for people as well. So I really am excited about the research that we're doing here in Los Angeles. And Travis was also mentioning this. It's been fantastic being at Cal State LA because many of the students are from Los Angeles. They grew up in Los Angeles. They have deep, deep ties with their communities. And so doing research in their backyards is thrilling and exciting, and yeah, it's just been really fun. So anyway, what we're going to do here is talk about income inequality, racial segregation, and urban avifauna. And I threw in biodiversity there, but just the tale of biodiversity in LA. And what's happening here with this talk is I'm actually pulling together some data sets from various projects that we've done over the year and trying to tie them all together into this knot, or at least connect the dots with some patterns that I'm going to show you today, which are somewhat, they're things that we need to work on, I feel like, in terms of improving biodiversity in the city. And so, as Travis mentioned, if you have a question, I think I would prefer that you hold off until the end, or maybe throw the question in the chat, and then we can go from there. So just to get everything started, I want to give a shout out to two amazing students who none of this research would be possible without them. And one is Savan Essian and the other is Christian Benitez. Savan is here, and love you, man. I'm so glad you're here. Savan was my first grad student and really laid the tracks for a lot of the data collection that I'm going to be showing, at least the first part of this project. And then when getting into the second part, Christian Benitez, who just recently finished in the lab, doing a really cool project with remote sensing and birds in urban environments. He picked up some of the work that Savan was doing in terms of some of the sampling. And so, again, without these two, there would be no data for a project like this. We feel we have really novel data in this lab because we really go out and we try to do these very standardized types of surveys that you would do in like kind of far off protected areas, but we do them right in the middle of the city, right on the side of the street. It's kind of hard because often there's lots of noise and all that. But nevertheless, we wouldn't be able to answer questions like which we're going to be presenting to you today without the hard work of folks like this. So what am I going to be talking about today? And there's three things that I'm going to be covering. And for the first part, I'm going to put on my professor cap a little bit and talk about urban ecosystems and urban ecology and the state of urban ecology and why it's an exciting field. And then we're going to relate that to cool things going on in LA. Second, I'm going to talk about social ecological theories that explain patterns of urban biodiversity, and there's two in particular that I'm going to be talking about that focus on legacy and luxury. So legacy, we're going to be focused on historical redlining, and then we're also going to be looking at contemporary patterns of income inequality and racial segregation and how all those are related to the current distribution of urban avifauna and algae. And then I'm going to get into the research objectives, and I'm not even detailing those. There's 5 of them, so I'll get to those eventually when we get to that portion of the presentation. Okay, so I like to show this picture of LA because it's kind of an old picture. When you're looking at downtown, there's a lot of new buildings there, but that's fitting for me in thinking about how things have changed over time when we're thinking about these urban ecosystems like LA. And urban areas are amazing because they are definitely marked by change, whether that's new development, communities, people coming and going, just different cultural preferences, whatever it might be. They're these fantastically amazing places when we're thinking about biodiversity and urban ecology. And I just want to throw out a couple definitions just to set the scene about what novel ecosystems are. So novel ecosystems are human-built, modified, or engineered niches of the Anthropocene. Anthropocene is a little bit jargony, but it just simply means that we're now living in the Anthropocene where almost every ecosystem is in some way kind of touched by people or at least influenced by people. And that's no more apparent than in a place like an urban ecosystem. So anything that's human caused, which has changed an ecosystem from its natural state, can be considered a novel ecosystem. And of course, there are other factors that can also contribute to novelty in ecosystems, including climate change, invasive species, potentially changes in chemical or water quality, lots of different things that can do that. But nevertheless, what we're going to be focused on with the urban ecosystems are basically these totally manicured systems and what they've really done when we make all these decisions about how we're developing cities for biodiversity. So to think about this a little bit and to set this into context, this is a picture of San Francisco or Golden Gate Park. This is Kelly's Cove, I believe. In 1870. Look at these dune fields, just amazing, going up from Ocean Beach, totally incredible. I'd love to see what's out there. There are probably some amazing butterflies and plants and all sorts of stuff there. So this is in the 1870s, and then of course you zoom in today, and what's there but Golden Gate Park? And this is all just, if you've been up to Golden Gate Park, it's an amazing place, forested ecosystem. But it's like Disneyland. It's totally just made up on what used to be a natural ecosystem. So this is what I'm talking about novel ecosystem and change over time. And this is also just an example of what's gone on all over California, all over the country, even earlier in some other, especially in like the eastern portions of the country. But it's definitely happening in lots of parts of the world. Think of countries like China that are developing very rapidly. And so this is certainly not just something that's happened here. All right, so just a little bit more about urbanization. When we look at this red box up here, this is just looking at the land area around the world that's rural, urban areas of fewer than 1 million, 1 to 10 million, or 10 million or more. They're definitely dominated by rural areas. And if we're looking at change over time from the cities in the 1950s, the 3 largest cities were New York, the metropolitan area, which had 12.3 million people, Tokyo, and then London. And then when you zoom down to 2016, the top 3 cities are Tokyo, Jakarta, and Delhi. And look at those numbers of people in those cities. And all across the world, when you're going from 1950 to 2007 to 2030, there's been dramatic increases in people moving to cities. So again, I just want to underscore and stress that as conservation biologists, as people that are interested in natural history, as people that are living in cities, we definitely need to be thinking about our cities in terms of what do they do and what their potential are for biodiversity. And I imagine most people here on this call or this talk are doing that. All right, so how do urban ecosystems differ from their natural ecosystems? There's tons of examples, whether it's impervious surfaces, that's the amount of hardscape, urban heat islands that you tend to form, and especially in like the urban core where there's so much radiation of heat from all the hardscape. Could be urban vegetation. Lots of cities have tons and tons of species of plants, way more so than the natural areas that are just adjacent. Urban plant phenology, when plants flower, whether they're exotic, whether they're native but responding differently to something like a heat island, are totally different and unnatural compared with their natural areas. Urban wildlife, cities do have a lot of wildlife diversity, but not to the same scale as vegetation when you're just looking purely at numbers. And there are some patterns of things, quote, like biotic homogenization, where if you're to go from LA to San Diego to even places like Phoenix, you would find a lot of the same species in each of those cities. So it's really just animals and wildlife taking advantage of the various niches that you find in urban locations. So urban ecology, just the definition, is just simply the study of interactions of organisms and their environment environment set within urban ecosystems. And I just want to highlight that really urban ecology for decades, people weren't studying or thinking about urban systems as a place to do ecological research. But this has really taken off over the past couple decades, in particular because of two projects, one in Baltimore and one in Phoenix. These were federally funded by the National Science Foundation, urban ecological, socio-ecological research centers, where there's just been a ton of incredible research that set the stage for urban ecology research in the United States, but also across the world. And it's actually a new one too. I believe it's in Minneapolis, where there's a new LTER, long-term ecological research site in an urban area. So just lots of exciting things. LA, and just want to highlight this really quick. What does this mean for LA? LA, we are, and just like in many other things, we can pat ourselves on the back, leaders in the world with urban ecological research too. Just a couple of years ago, there was a conference up in Portland, Oregon, the International Urban Wildlife Conference, and there 30 to 40% of the talks were from Los Angeles. So there's a lot of people doing a lot of amazing things in the area here. All right, so what is it when you're zooming into urban ecosystems and you're thinking about, hey, what is it? There's lots of amazing things to highlight on, whether it's trees, shrubs, things that people do to plant all over the place. It could be the cultural diversity of places and whether people have preferences for how they want communities developed or certain plants that they want to plant in their yards or whatever that might be, and thinking about how that diversity and the human diversity can also influence the biodiversity is super exciting. And what I just want to highlight before I jump into this talk is just this idea about heterogeneity. Cities, especially a place like Los Angeles, when you're just looking over the whole thing, are really these just amazingly heterogeneous places, again, on biodiversity, cultural diversity, and that just brings a lot of interest and excitement in my lab and us trying to figure out how does that relate to patterns of biodiversity. So, Professor kept kind of off, and I'll start jumping into some of the research here and getting into some of these social ecological theories that are really interesting that guide some of the research that I'm going to be presenting today. There's two things I want to talk about. First, I'm going to discuss the legacy effect hypothesis, which suggests that environmental changes, or posits environmental changes, are the result from historic human activities. And an example of this, imagine a forest was cut down 100 years ago, and then it grew back to some secondary growth forest. You go survey birds there, and then you go survey birds in an adjacent old growth forest, and the bird communities are very different. There's a legacy effect there that's influencing why, in terms of how we are using the landscape, in terms of why the bird communities might be different. You can also apply this to urban centers and saying maybe like a zoning law or some kind of practice that was done in terms of where investment was made or not made, or whether people made decisions to plant lots of trees or not lots of trees, or whatever it might be, that also could be under the umbrella of legacy effects. And we're going to talk about redlining in particular when we get to this one. The second one, and really interesting socio-ecological hypothesis that I'm going to talk about today, is the luxury effect. And so the luxury effect posits that there's a positive relationship between affluence and organism diversity or activity in urban ecosystems. And basically what this means is that affluent places, high-income places, people living in locations where there's quite a bit of money, have the means to support things like decadent yards, trees, maybe gardeners, whatever it means, and especially in an arid place, water, so you can support vegetation and all that, amenities that you might want in your house or your neighborhood that also are beneficial for attracting wildlife. So we're going to get to that too and highlight that a little bit more. So what about the legacy effect hypothesis? Well, I just want to briefly do a Reader's Digest version about redlining and how we're going to get into that a little bit today. You can see this really interesting map. This is drawn in the 1930s of these red and yellow and blue and green areas. And so what was going on? Faced with just basically a housing shortage, the U.S. government initiated a program to increase and segregate the country's housing stock. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation, it's called HOLC, which you're going to see that term throughout, which was created under the New Deal, was established. And effectively what it was doing, and there's more details to this, but just in a nutshell, it drew lines around neighborhoods, whether they were red, yellow, blue, or green, that were responsible for influencing investment in communities or disinvestment, or just just stopping investment in general. So areas like Beverly Hills up here in West LA got lots of investment. No surprise when you go there now and you check out that place. San Marino, or in the San Gabriel Valley, another example if you live in that part of LA. The blue locations here were also heavily invested in, and then when you start getting into the yellow and red, those were not. And you might be wondering, well, why why was there investment in some communities and not in others? And it's really important to mention that this was certainly a racist tactic, and so it was meant to buoy communities that were more or less white, and then other ones where there were people of color. And back in the 1930s, this was certainly targeted at Black or African American communities. And so the practice was widespread in cities all across the country in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and then it was halted in the 1960s. And there's been various acts passed in Congress to counter this, to try to invest more in certain communities, but it certainly is likely, because it was such a big deal for so many decades, that it definitely carries over and having effects on biodiversity today. There's been some really interesting research out from this paper from Dexter Locke in 2021. I love this paper. It just shows a variation in tree cover in different cities from LA to Chicago, Cleveland. You can see the cities there. And what you want to notice in these different categories is A, heavily invested, and then D, those red line zones. And you can see in LA that there's huge differences in tree canopy cover when you go from the A sites to the D sites. What we're interested in, of course, being an avian ecology lab, is, well, what the heck does this do for wildlife? You know, is this also going to carry over and affect wildlife? You would kind of think so, but we really just don't know. And so that's one thing that we are certainly interested in. And then we're also interested in just other features of urban habitat, moving beyond tree canopy cover and seeing, are there other ways that potentially a practice like redlining might affect biodiversity. So this is our luxury effect that we're thinking about. Now I want to focus a little bit on the legacy effect. And I just want to highlight some work from myself and Savan. Savan is really the engine with this one. We're thinking about street trees and socioeconomics. And so if you're just looking at street tree density, those are the trees planted on the rights of way that you notice in like residential neighborhoods. There's far more in high-income parts of LA than in low-income parts. And if you're looking at the relationship with migratory birds, you would see that there's way more migratory birds in these high-income locations than low-income. So this it could be related to some luxury effect stuff, but this really is, or sorry, the legacy effect. But this really is just looking at that idea about luxury and about where the money is and about where you have these amenities that might attract birds. So it's certainly a thing here in LA. There's been people who've looked at this all around the world, and again, people who've found it in cities in other parts of the world. All right, so just kind of setting the stage for sharing some of the research objectives here, and there's 5 that I want to share with you today. So first, we're going to look at patterns of urban habitat and birds throughout Los Angeles. Second, we're going to look at drivers of bird abundance. So that's what are actually causing some of these patterns, or behind that. I don't want to say cause, but what are behind that. Looking at maps of habitat features and bird distributions. I think this is going to be some of the exciting part because you can visually see some of these patterns. Then we're going to look at some of how our predictions relate to some of the redlined areas. And this is really important because we didn't specifically sample all over, but I'm going to show you how, based on some of our maps, we can actually look at every single part of Los Angeles. And then the last one, we're going to look at race and ethnicity and how those are related to urban avifauna in LA. And the reason why we're doing that is because redlining was certainly a racist thing and racist practice. And so we were just interested in, like, well, what does that look like now? And what does that look like, you know, whatever this practice was, for the current distribution of race and ethnicity in Los Angeles. Okay, so how did we do this and how to set this up? So we originally started surveying at these black dots. There are 39 of them all over LA, and this was part of our street tree work that we were really kind of focused on in terms of figuring out where street trees were in LA and how that influenced feeding birds. When you overlay those sampling locations with these red-lined areas, and I'm just going to say red line, but that means all 4 of these categories, we had strong overlap with quite a few of them. And what we did was we decided we're going to do a study where we're going to look at these best zones, these A and B zones, where there used to be a lot of investment. We had 12 sampling locations in those areas. These C and D zones, which were where there wasn't much investment, there's 13 locations. And then not redlined or not graded is what I should say right there. There were 14 locations. These 14 locations are really important because this is our way of trying to tease apart that luxury versus legacy thing that I was just talking about. in those previous slides. So at all these locations, if you were to go out, if Savan or Christian was to go out to one of these locations, this is what it would look like. You would actually see it, 4 of these sampling stations set upon a walking route that was about 3 kilometers in length. And at each of these 4 locations, Savan or Christian would sample all the birds in one of these locations. There were 156 total. We did this over 3 winters in 2016, 2017, 2017 and 2018, and then follow-ups in 2020 and 21. And so 4 visits during actually 6 visits, so 2 visits per winter over the 3 winters. At each of these locations, just to focus our patterns a little bit, we did a bunch of statistics. We looked at all the bird communities there, and then we grouped birds by whether they were forest birds. Those are birds that are associated with things like trees, and so that would be like kind of their general breeding conditions. And those could be species, and it's 12 species. Those could be species that do not migrate, like an acorn woodpecker, or species that do migrate that would be here during the winter, like a yellow-rumped warbler. On the other hand, we created a group of urban birds, and these were birds that are associated with, like, your parking lots and pigeons and European starlings, house finches. There's 10 species there. So at all these locations, we summed up all those birds that were forest birds or urban birds, and then we mushed them all together into just to one big sample here. So our sample size was 39 for the analyses. And then we did a lot of remote sensing work and some other kind of technical things that I don't want to get into for this talk to quantify habitat. So moving forward, let's look at patterns of habitat and birds from all these kind of really cool field data that we have. So if we're just looking at what is it that is, kind of the differences between these A, B, C, D, and not graded sites. And so just looking at land values, so these are just the parcel values, the appraised values of these parcels where we're doing our samples within the 100-meter circles. And they're, of course, way higher still in these, quote, best zones, these A, B zones. The square footage of houses is much bigger in those A, B zones and then much smaller in those areas that were historically redlined. Those kind of not graded areas. I should say that a lot of the houses in these not graded areas were built in the 70s and 80s, so much more recent than houses in these locations. Tree canopy is much greater in those A, B than C, D zones. And then the impervious surface cover is the opposite of that, so much greater in those redlined areas. So this is still, think about this. This is 90 years later. We might still be seeing potentially some of these legacy effects of that investment that was going on in the 30s and 40s. All right, so just take home those redlined areas, lower land values, smaller homes, less tree canopy, and more impervious surface. So how about the birds? This is an Audubon talk, so you're probably most interested in what's going on with the birds. So for our forest bird abundance, they also track much higher in, quote, those A, B than the C, D zones. And then the urban bird abundance was much higher in those redlined areas that you can see right up here. So very clear patterns. And what we do in my lab all the time and what I teach in classes all the time is whenever you see patterns like this, especially if you're looking at like patterns of habitat, patterns of wildlife, you want to try to figure out, are there correlations? Are there some types of relationships with that? Because then if you're starting to see some relationships, then you could start building the basis for some experiments or some further kind of more detailed studies. And so that's kind of where we're at right now, is like, what are the correlations here with why we're noticing these patterns with lower migratory bird abundance or higher urban bird abundance in the redlined areas? Well, let's just look at that. I'm going to show you a couple figures here, and these are pretty darn eye-opening, at least for me, when we first started fitting these models. So when you're just looking at bird abundance, and we fit all sorts of different models, 20-something variables, saying what's the most important one that explains forest bird diversity and forest bird abundance and urban bird abundance. And by far and away, it's just land value. And by land value, by far and away, for those of you that have been trained on this stuff and these statistics, this is 70% of the variation is explained just simply by knowing what the parcel value is of a house in an area. It's the opposite with the urban birds. And note the different colors, those A, B, C, D, and not graded zones. You can see those and where they kind of rank here. So for urban bird abundance, 55% of the variation is explained simply with land value. The other important metric, tree canopy cover, 44% of the variation is explaining forest bird abundance. and a little bit less so, but still important. Tree canopy explains 27% of the urban bird abundance in LA. Of note, you might be wondering, isn't land value correlated with tree canopy cover? They are. They're about 55% correlated, so there is a little bit of wiggle room there for some other unexplained things going on. So interesting though, but these are the big ones when you're thinking about what drives bird abundances around the city. And there's other people that have kind of like said, oh, it's just all about trees or all this stuff, but we're trying to look at this through a historical lens. Remember, we're looking at these through these sites that, again, 90 years ago were subjected to this redlining practice. So very strong correlations between land value and tree canopy cover with our forest birds and urban birds. All right, so we're thinking, all right, let's just see what it looks like when we're spatially looking across LA at these habitat features and these bird groups that we're looking at. And what you can do, and I just will kind of talk about this for 1 second, not 1 second, that would be impossible, but a minute, is you can take these models and you can take these relationships, and then if you have the appropriate data, like the land value data across a much larger area than where you did your sample, or you have the tree canopy cover across a much larger area where you did your sample, you can create these predictive maps of forest bird abundance based on the land value and the land value across LA, or the tree canopy cover across LA. These are actually the two variables that we use for our predictive maps. So when I show you this predictive map in a minute of these bird abundances, there's a lot that went on in the background to make them, but really it's related to these two relationships right here. All right, so let's get into this a little bit. So just looking across Los Angeles here, we're just looking at the percent of tree canopy cover in parcels throughout LA, and it's striking how different it is when you look across the city. And you might say, well, it's because it's in the foothills of La Habra and Whittier or Palos Verdes, or these areas that historically had some type of tree canopy cover. That's where a lot of our oak and walnut woodlands used to be in some of these locations, and that's certainly true. But there's also just lots of locations that maybe, and these are the valley bottoms, of course, which we're all familiar with. Maybe they had some form of tree canopy riparian areas. Unclear. Travis, the potential natural vegetation map would help us out with talking about this one here. But nevertheless, you can really see that tree canopy cover is absolutely not distributed evenly. And I don't know if that needs to be, because there were so many different ecosystems that were all over here, but at least seeing this right now across the city, it's very, very different. Okay. So how about land value? Well, land value is a little bit interesting because you can see places like in the South Bay, like Manhattan Beach, Hermosa Beach, where there's not a lot of tree cover, but extremely affluent. Same with Palos Verdes. Same with some locations in West LA. When you're comparing where the tree canopy cover is to where the parcel land value is. And then, of course, it drops off substantially when you're in South LA and then moving on into East LA and then getting into kind of the central and eastern portions of the San Gabriel Valley or the San Fernando Valley. So land value, radically different. Radically different when we're looking at distribution of parcel land values across LA. So how do these two relate to if you were to make a prediction of forest bird abundance across LA? Well, this is what it looks like right here. And there's a lot going on in this map in terms, again, of how to make it, but we feel really good about it in terms of like the technical stuff that went into it and the accuracy. We did a lot of validation with this. This is where Christian's data comes in based on Saban's initial data, and there's like really, like, you can very well correlate some of the other areas where we went and did some bird counts with some of the initial counts, the data that went into these models. All right, so where are all the forest birds? Well, it's kind of interesting to note, are they really there in Manhattan Beach and Hermosa Beach and Redondo Beach if there's not a lot of tree cover there? Well, that's a good place for us to go and go check out. So there are some locations where we're not 100% sure, where we actually didn't do some of our sampling, but across much of LA, we think this is a pretty darn accurate map. This is kind of the area where I end up spending a lot of my time. I live in the San Gabriel Valley, and I feel like it's extremely accurate for this part of Los Angeles. Those of you in West LA or some other places could help me out if we haven't gone and surveyed there. Okay, so how about the urban bird abundance? It's like the exact opposite, which is very similar to those kind of scatter plot things we were looking at that had very different patterns. So urban bird abundance is much lower and along the coast, in the San Gabriel Valley much higher, and South LA, East LA. So you're thinking, okay, well, cool. What does this mean with all this? And I'm going to start trying to connect the dots here with showing these maps and what the relationships are back to the redlining. So that's where this next portion of the research will come in. And when we're just looking at forest bird, these are our maps, and we're just overlaying them with the HOLC grades, these A, B, C, and D zones. You see this very similar, very striking pattern in terms of where all the forest bird abundance is. This y-axis variable is, some of you might be wondering, what does that actually mean? What it means is, if you were to go to any location on this map and stand anywhere, say you're in Inglewood, and within a 200-meter circle around you, you would have this many urban bird abundance or so. So that's the way this map is scaled. So whenever you're looking at this right here, you can just say, wherever I am, if I'm in one of these A areas, there should effectively be about 90-something birds, or forest birds, that I could find in that location. All right, so just to put some numbers on here, the average value is 94 for the A location, 58 for the D, and that's a 39% difference, so a substantial difference in terms of the abundance of forest birds in these locations. How about the urban bird abundance? And again, it's this opposite pattern. I'm going to be a broken record talking about this by the end of this talk, but it's still interesting, I think, to see some of these patterns. So if we were to look at some of the numbers here, the A zones, the average is I think I have that, yeah, 110 right here. And then the D is 145, and that's a 24% difference. So you might say, okay, well, these are the areas that were historically, that had those like red line maps drawn. What about places in LA that were not graded? And so that's what these are, all other census tracts, everything that were not subjected to that practice based on our predictive maps. So what we see here is also a very similar trend when you go from low to medium to high income areas. This is just us taking the land value and basically chopping it into thirds to come up with this high, medium, and low values. And so what you see here, the low areas, the average, it's actually different from the previous map, about 44 forest birds. The high is actually less. I'll show these on the same slide, and that's a 28% difference. And then when you're going for these urban birds, and you're looking at the difference between the high and the low, there's a 22% difference. Okay, so I just walked you through kind of a lot of different things and a lot of different figures, and you might be saying, what do all these numbers mean? I want to tie this back to this. And so what do we find a little bit more support with the legacy effect hypothesis or the luxury effect hypothesis? And all those zones that were subjected to the red line practice, when we look at them, and I just showed this number, there's a 39% difference between the A and D in forest birds and 24% difference in urban birds. And then when we look in those non-graded zones, it's actually quite a bit less, the magnitude of difference based on our predictions for those forest birds, about the same for urban birds. So what I want you to take away from this figure right here, and the thing that is really important, is that this 100% still matters to what's going on in Los Angeles in terms of the distribution of birds that we have. Forest birds, remember, 12 species of birds. These are birds that a lot of us birders like to go out and actually see, like a Townsend's warbler, a black-throated gray warbler, an orange-crowned warbler. And when you're kind of saying, well, your friend flies into town in the wintertime and says, I want to go find all those birds, chances are you go to one of these locations that were drawn in the 1930s with a green line around it, and you're going to have a good chance of actually seeing them. The luxury effect is still a thing in Los Angeles, but again, and it's kind of hard, these are correlated a little bit, but we tend to find a little bit more support for this. All right, so I'm going to do a time check here. I think I've got a little bit more time to get through this last objective, so another 5 minutes or so of the talk here. All right, so let's just look at some of the correlations with race and ethnicity and urban avifauna in Los Angeles. And some of the stuff, so I use the US Census, that's what we've done, and we just use the 2020 census and data they had in terms of the distribution of different races in LA, and for those we're using Black or African American, and these are just US Census terms, Asian or white, and I know they just kind of shove a lot of things together in those census terms. And then for ethnicity, we're using Hispanic or Latino. And so I'm just trying to use standard language there when saying those names. So how does this all look? I'm going to show some maps first of just the distribution of race and ethnicity in LA. And so some of this might be familiar to if you studied some of this stuff or whatever, you lived in Los Angeles a long time. But when we're looking at the Black or African American population in Los Angeles, the highest density in terms of census areas are moving in that location from Inglewood going down into South Central LA in that southeast direction. There's a few other locations going into Long Beach, Altadena, Pasadena, where in terms of the Black or African American population. When you're looking at the white population, Palos Verdes, South Bay, West LA, Santa Monica Mountains, all across the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains, the border of Orange County. Of course, it's very different, when we're looking at these two right here. And Travis mentioned I have like LA roots. I actually don't. My family lives down in San Diego. I'm from the Bay Area. But I was pretty kind of shocked when I first moved here. It felt pretty segregated to me in certain locations. And then when we started looking into some of these maps, you can kind of see some of this stuff. And I just didn't know because I wasn't from Los Angeles. Okay, in terms of Asian, San Gabriel Valley, going along the 60 freeway, getting out into Hacienda Heights, out to Diamond Bar, Cerritos, Palos Verdes, La Cañada, and then Hispanic or Latino, moving into South Central to East LA, all the way out through the San Gabriel Valley in the central and eastern portions, and then the central, I don't know if I'd call it central, but the San Fernando Valley. All right, so what does this mean and why am I showing all this stuff? Well, because we overlay these maps with those bird maps, and then we can start looking at some correlations. And that's what I'm going to show you in the next handful of slides. So first, let's just look at how race, and this is the current distribution of race and ethnicity among the HLC codes. And the data I'm going to show you right now, if we're looking at all these census blocks, there had to be a majority of a census block that was originally drawn with one of those red-lined or green-lined areas to actually qualify for this analysis. So we're looking at the Black African American population throughout Los Angeles. Moving from A to B, there's a slight uptick in C and D zones, but it's kind of similar across when you're moving across these different zones. These are actually statistically higher because there's so many data points in there in the C and D areas. For white, moving from A to B, and notice the percentage in the census blocks down into C and D, and then the not graded zones, and these are much higher statistically significant than the C and D areas. For Asian, there's a little bit of a blip in A, B, and also A down to B, but then back up in C. So it's kind of interesting looking at these patterns. And then for Hispanic or Latino, going from A, B, and then C and D zones. This is important, and this is something I'm just learning as a researcher going through this in terms of this program was initially targeting Black or African American community, the redlining thing. And so there's been a real shift in terms of, where it was initially targeted and then who's living and which communities are living, in those communities that were subjected to this practice. All right, so what about the correlations between race and ethnicity and birds? And what do we see here? So this is just, I'm only going to show forest birds because the urban birds is kind of the opposite. This is for Black or African American, and this is a very weak relationship. So there's really not much of a relationship here when you're looking at the Black or African American population. The reason why I'm showing this is because I'm very interested in who is experiencing bird diversity and bird abundance in the city, and if there's ways that we should be thinking about how we're kind of going about some of the conservation stuff differently in the city. For the white population, there's a strong positive, and this is a pretty strong positive correlation. And note the distribution of these, red and yellow, those are from the same HLC grades. Asian, there's not much of a relationship there. This is a very weak relationship. The reason why it's significant is because there's so many dots on these maps. And then for the Hispanic or Latino population, it's the opposite that you're finding so strong negative correlation in terms of experiencing this forest bird abundance throughout the city. And when thinking about this and thinking about I don't know, these are actually kind of hot off the press results, like stuff I've been working on just recently. And so I haven't quite wrapped my mind around everything here in terms of what all this means. But it means something, and we're working on the paper here in terms of trying to figure out, I'll get to it in the next couple slides here. Well, just in summary, I just want to share kind of what we covered, sort of the big take-homes from this talk. So the legacy of redlining continues to strongly affect urban avifauna and bird habitat in LA. That's clear from all these data. And so it's taking beyond some of those interesting results from Locke that I was showing earlier and saying this is certainly a thing for wildlife as well. Both the luxury and legacy effect hypotheses are important frameworks, though legacy is potentially stronger. Still working on trying to tease those apart, but that's what my initial thoughts are on all this. And the Hispanic or Latino communities experience lower diversity and abundance of urban avifauna. And this is something that, again, I'm hoping these patterns here, there's a lot of amazing people in LA doing, we were already talking about this, urban ecological research, outreach, and whatever it is. And so I'm hoping that we're still kind of building and putting together this puzzle in terms of biodiversity here in LA, and everybody that wants to experience it can. So I just want to get into, actually don't know if I want to share this slide because this is different data for these natural land birds. So I'm just going to kind of talk about what some of the solutions are here. So we can actually do here when we're looking at redlining and urban biodiversity and conservation and management. So investment is certainly key in communities, but I think we must be careful about this, and we want to do this to avoid displacement. So if people are living in a community happy, you don't want to just toss a lot of money in there and all of a sudden have, people move in and kind of push other people out. And I know that's an ongoing thing, and that's tough, but certainly this is something to be mindful of. So while not a component of this research, it's very likely critical to understand cultural preferences for urban biodiversity. Understand that while yes, investment might be amazing in terms of planting trees all over the place, we should also be mindful that everybody's got to have their different preferences about what they want and shouldn't be forced on people. So it's certainly something that probably a lot of people have done research on, but I haven't. But I would love to understand more about the cultural preferences of people throughout LA and what actually urban biodiversity means for them. Birds and biodiversity are certainly resilient, but if conservation is a goal, we must design cities focused on incorporating habitat features. The simplest one definitely is tree cover. LA is really kind of going for it with this, which is great to see. We're kind of advocating hopefully for to continue doing that, but looking at more nuanced approaches in terms of native plants or certain ones that are going to be beneficial to birds as well. So communities potentially can rebound from redlining. On one of that earlier slide, I was going to show some examples of how that might have changed, but really this hasn't happened throughout much of LA. So 90 years on, this is still something that, and a lot of people have been thinking about this stuff. So we're not trying to point out anything new here, but just definitely saying, at least for focused on birds and all that, this is still a major problem. All right, so a lot of results with that, and this is what we're doing right now with this, and this is kind of a big collaboration. There's a lot of people who are a part of this research, and we're just in the phase of kind of being done with the analysis and starting to write all this up. So what I want to open up when we get into questions next, but also just feedback, because there may be some folks that have been thinking about this or done some research on this, because we're piecing together this story and we think it's a really interesting story, and we want to be careful and make sure it's we're saying all the right, things that are going to have the most impact with all these patterns that we're finding. All right, so with that, I'm just going to say thanks, and I look forward to your questions in the forum or discussion. By forum, I mean the chat. And by discussion, I mean just unmute yourself and ask questions.
Thank you, Eric. And so you hear the applause of 80 people out here who've been following along, and we have another 7 or 8 over on Facebook. And my apologies for remembering San Diego wrong. I'm sorry.
No problem. Yeah.
Yeah. So Ursula has a couple of questions in the chat that we can start with. And I'll read them both and you can take them in turn. First is, are there any data how bird feeding drives bird abundance? And second, how do data about American cities compare to cities that have not had historical redlining? Does land value still correlate with tree cover and bird abundance? Thinking Copenhagen, Hamburg, Madrid, Algiers.
Great question. So the first one about bird feeding, there's loads of evidence that bird feeding certainly influences birds. Examples, I lived in the Midwest where it's much more of kind of like a thing that everybody does during the winter time. And there's lots of research saying that during the winter, if you live in a place like Madison, Wisconsin, you're actually kind of reconfiguring the bird community in certain neighborhoods if there's lots of feeders. And so you could have pretty radical effects on birds with feeding. I honestly don't feel like, at least in the part of LA where I live in, we have a bird feeder, but I don't think anybody else in our neighborhood does. And so I don't feel like it's as much of a practice here as other places I've lived. But certainly for hummingbirds or whatever, it's a big deal. I have a kind of a random story. When I grew up in Santa Rosa, actually, and my parents had a bird feeder up there. And there was a Western tanager that would visit my parents' feeder each year. And the reason why we knew it was the same one, because it had a certain little spot on its back, on its feather. And so that was kind of our identifying mark. And so I think if you have bird feeders too, birds are amazing in terms of their migration pathways, their site fidelity to certain places, their memory. And so you can certainly really attract birds with a feeder. Now, in terms of the cities where this redlining hasn't happened, your second question, it's a great question. There's been some really interesting research, the global research, which has looked at this. And in general, and I'm just going to say in general, because there's certainly cities that don't follow this pattern, the luxury effect happens across the world in different cities, whether there's cities that are totally developed differently than what you find here in the States, definitely in Europe, because those are some of the, I think those were some of the examples you brought up, Travis. But it's a thing. Interestingly, and I do want to bring up this point, I was a mentor during a recent conference. That was this international conference, and I was speaking with an Australian student who was in Melbourne, and we were talking about basically this, and she was saying that's just not a thing there, even though I've seen some other papers. So maybe it's not as much of an effect as something here because of this practice that we notice. But thanks. Yeah, it's definitely lots of cool research out there on that luxury effect.
Great. A question from Edith. You showed a very interesting data and novel way to look at the consequence of redlining. With respect to the diversity of forest versus urban birds, is there any difference in value between urban and forest abundance? Is one better than the other, or do you look at these only as an indicator for inequity?
That's a great question, Edith. I should have talked about that because it's really important. The reason why we focus on the forest birds in particular is because almost every member of that group, their populations are going down. And so from a value and just valuing biodiversity and valuing species that are in decline, and we're losing birds all across. There's been a famous paper a couple years ago about how many birds we've been losing across the country and world, and it's staggering. I actually feel like this year is a really down year for a lot of wintering birds. When I go out just in my local birding places, it feels like there's way less like yellow-rumped warblers and it felt like that last year too. So I don't know if the drought and fire and other things up north where those species breed is having some kind of effect. But definitely getting back to your question, Edith, yes, there's very high conservation value in that forest bird group, and that's why we focus on that really on that one. Not that those urban birds are not cool, because they are, but I would say, from that valuation standpoint, their populations are tending to do okay.
Great. So Thea has her hand up and can unmute and ask a question.
Should I stop sharing my screen, or should I
Yeah, you
keep
can
it?
do that, and maybe you'll see
Okay.
more people that way. Thea, are you able to unmute?
All right, now I'm good.
You're good.
I have just a question about gentrification.
Yes.
So I know, like, for example, I grew up in Echo Park, which is used to have tons and tons of like little courtyard apartments with with everyone had fruit trees and gardens and stuff, and now with gentrification, a lot of those are being changed into like huge condos that just fill the entire the block, you know what I mean? And so I'm just wondering, in terms of, I guess, the luxury effect, it's like maybe now these obviously they're worth hundreds and hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, but they're not actually that nice. You know what I mean? It's not like,
Yeah,
I don't know. So
it's a
yeah, if
great
you compare changing land values, I guess. Yeah.
it's a great point. Travis and I have talked about this. Travis has done really cool research on this in terms of like increasing hardscape, mega mansion development, especially some places in the San Gabriel Valley. The example you're talking about in Echo Park, anywhere where you increase hardscape, even if it's like based on gentrification or just like way radically increasing, house prices from something that used to be maybe like a dilapidated house and then it was bought out and turned into like a luxury condo. That's not good. Like in terms of birds, in terms of that, like because you're removing, whatever, if there were fruit trees or some other kind of thing that were providing habitat for insects that were pulling in the insectivorous birds, you're destroying all of that with that process. And so from like a gentrification standpoint, like it's interesting to actually think about that and think if, you know, as I was kind of talking in that second slide, how things are constantly changing in urban areas and how that's kind of exciting. If we start doing things like exactly what you're suggesting, that's going to be a net loss across the board when we're thinking about just things like birds. So I actually think that would be and I've asked Travis about this before, like if we can have a collaboration on like looking at gentrification, and we might. Maybe there's a way
I,
we'll figure out how to do that.
I have, I guess, a follow-up question and sort of like a solution for that, because I noticed with your maps, the, I guess, red line districts line up really well with when you look at the maps of park poor districts in LA. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? Where, and so if there could just be like mandatory park improvements in these areas, I think that would help with the birds.
Yeah,
And I guess
absolutely.
my follow-up question was, did you find that like a lot of the birds you were finding were in private land or park land, like in all your sites, or did it
These
not
are all
change
great
that?
questions and all things. So all data and even those resulting maps are all residential zones. And so we didn't survey in parks or anything. And we deliberately avoided, like real busy streets or industrial zones just for this research because it was just a residential zone project. We have done research all across LA and parks for sure. And what you mentioned about like park poor areas, they totally correlate with these historic redlined areas. It's actually kind of interesting. One of the patterns that we've noticed, and I think we're getting close to submitting this paper from a former grad student, is that in areas of LA, if like there's only one park and then it's just nothing but like urban around it, hardscape and all that stuff, those parks tend to have kind of a lot of birds because there's not a whole lot else around there. Whereas when you go to places where there's like a real well-developed tree canopy, we tend not to find much in parks. So it's kind of like a weird refugia effect
Oh,
in
interesting.
like those hard core areas, but they definitely need more for public health reasons, but it would definitely benefit things like birds as well.
Yeah. So, and I just want to mention before I go on to this next question, if you're on Facebook and want to put something in the comments, I'll keep track of that and bring that question over here. From Max O, who I also want to thank for posting links to a couple of things in the chat as we went along, a few papers, says, is it possible to study further as to why higher property values correlate so strongly with forest bird species? What specific properties of high value areas are missing in lower value areas?
It's a good question, and this is something that Savan and I have talked about a lot, and we really just feel, because this is residential zone, and so we really just feel it's those decadent yards, it's the amount of trees, those like quote green amenities that people are putting in those really affluent areas. And it's it's bizarre. Well, the one thing that I don't know that's unanswered for me and in our research here, and this is I need to talk to people about this, or we need to talk to people about this, is if that's just a pure preference thing. Like if people have like tons of money, like they automatically prefer to have, decadent yards because it's a sign of affluence, or I don't know. Those are questions we don't
What's your
know. But
definition of decadent?
I'm just thinking like tons of exotic plants, flowering plants that are going to bring in hummingbirds and, butterflies and all that. Maybe not even wanting to bring in that stuff, but it would attract those types of things,
Right.
which you
Uh,
really see in some like really, and also one thing that we would notice in a lot of these counts, say you're standing on the corner of like and Savon does as well, like a corner like Beverly Hills, you're counting in people's yards basically, like a lot of the birds that are out there, and there might be a gate or something like that on the side of the street. So there would be some things in like the street trees and whatever, but a lot of it's going to be in people's yards. And if there's a huge lot size, there's a lot of there's basic kind of ecological things that like the more green area, whatever that's shrubs or trees, the more species diversity you're going to have just because there's more niches there that you might not find in other locations if it's like a lot more hardscape, maybe smaller lot sizes.
Good. So a couple of comments from the chat here. First from Carolyn, I assume this data should be used in working with children in different areas. They need to feel good about seeing and knowing their local birds, even if they are urban birds and not forest birds. Also from Annika, super fascinating talk. As a physician, I'm accustomed to seeing similar maps detailing racial and income-based health and food insecurity disparities in communities in LA impacted by redlining. Interesting parallels here.
Totally
Following
agree.
up,
It's crazy thinking about that.
yeah. Do you have a quick list of the urban versus forest birds? Or is that somewhere where that people can refer to?
Yeah, we can share that, and well, I can just say them. And for the urban bird or the forest birds, acorn woodpecker, yellow-rumped warbler, black-throated gray warbler, Townsend's warbler, ruby-crowned kinglet. There's a few more that I'm kind of, well, a handful more that I'm kind of forgetting right now off the top of my head. What I'll do, maybe there's a way I can like post this somehow on LA Audubon or something.
Okay, we can post it on the Facebook comments after the fact,
Yeah,
if you want to follow up there. And Ursula, we can
yeah.
get the
Thanks for
paper to
asking
you
that.
as well. Yeah. Um, Matthew says, is there a way to parse out expected bird distribution if the LA area were not urbanized? Seems like the affluent AB historic districts and high white population areas are in mountain and foothill areas, which might be naturally more prone to forest cover and therefore more forest bird abundance.
You basically just described our paper that we're working on, like looking at the historic avian communities from like the 1800s and how things have changed over time, and trying to figure out really, is it because there was a historical signal of always having those forest birds in those areas, or is it more current and contemporary management of the city, what that is? And so that's probably a couple years away from being done, but stay tuned. We're actually working on that right now. It's a great question, great thought.
Yep. Annika also would love to know whether urban gardens are oases or havens for biodiversity in these formerly redlined areas.
Totally, they are. And so we have another research project which is completed, and that we looked at native landscaping and yards and people's front yards, and we did that all over LA where we could find that. And just the basic pattern, the larger yard, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying, higher diversity, higher abundance of birds and insect pollinators. If you go to places like, and I'm thinking like more of these larger gardens, like the Arlington Gardens in Pasadena or the Huntington Gardens or something like that, those places are just like, they're their own little universe of birds because they're so big and they have like so many different resources that all attract birds, insects, all that.
Yeah. Sam Bressler, I think you have your hand up. Go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Thanks. I just had a question about the classification again. For some of these areas like Palos Verdes Peninsula, Pasadena, and sort of adjacent areas, would it be possible to look at, like the CSS Chaparral Guild at all? Things like thrasher, gnatcatcher, quail, things like that, or were those part of your forest guild of species, your forest community?
So what I didn't show, and hey Sam, good to hear from you. Thanks for showing up. It's we actually have another one that I didn't show called Natural Lands Birds, and that's a guild of some of these forest birds, but all those CSS shrub affiliated birds, and the signal is much weaker for them when you're looking at like these positive negative correlations, whereas they're like perfect opposites for that urban and forest bird. a lot of times it's a little bit of a flat line or just kind of a weak positive. So that's why I didn't show them for this talk, but we do include those in there. So important point to bring up for sure.
And
You know where
is
that
most
comes out? Sorry, Sam, just to follow up real quick. You know where we found that's really important is in our native yard landscaping work because a lot of that is shrubs that people are putting. And, we found like thrashers in people's yards. It's just like kind of crazy stuff when people are putting down a lot of those native shrubs.
Yeah, I've had thrashers and gnatcatchers in my native yard in Orange
Yeah,
County.
it's
Um,
great.
but would you say that is the weak signal would that be because there is just even there's like a higher threshold and even the even the more invested higher property value locations just aren't able to meet that threshold of the necessary habitat, and that's why there's no signal?
I think so. And so many of these places, we call them traditional yards and are, grass and trees and that kind of stuff. And I just feel like that's such a dominant feature of so many of these residential areas where we do our research. And so it does bring in those birds that like the trees, but then there's just like nothing for a lot of those like quote shrub affiliated birds unless, a lot of people have like hedges and then they're loaded with house sparrows.
Right.
You
So
know,
going on, we have a question from Kimmy.
thanks,
Do
Sam.
you Yep. Do you use any citizen community science apps in your research? How might teachers use the implications of your work in the classroom?
We don't, but not in a way that is negative because I love eBird, I love iNat. I think those are great in terms of they're great for a lot of reasons. They're great for research purposes. You can get really interesting data to look at. We don't use those because for a number of reasons. I love counting birds and going out and doing the field work, and that's what I want to train my students to do. And I want us to do like quote those like those standardized methods that are hard to get the same type of data with something like eBird. But eBird's fantastic in terms of students. My wife's a kindergarten teacher, and we're always thinking of ways to get. We have two kids, and we're always thinking of ways to get kids excited about this. And I feel like just knowing what you're seeing, whether it's through iNaturalist and taking a photo and showing it to a kid, I don't know, like about screen time and stuff, so you might want to think about that. But just knowing what's out there, putting a name to something, and then starting to learn a little bit about their ecology. Acorn woodpeckers, they like to be in places where there's oaks because there's acorns, but also things like palm trees or sycamores or soft trees that they can pound those acorns in. And then I feel like people start to light up with that. So in terms of eBird, we probably could have used it for this project, but we didn't, but maybe some other projects we will. I don't know if I answered the question, but I love all that stuff. I was at Cornell Lab of Ornithology before here, postdocing, and it was great kind of being a part of and seeing all the kind of cool things people are doing with those eBird data.
Comment from Inez. As Northeast LA as an example, it's currently being gentrified. So can increasing green spaces and make landscaping mandatory really benefit those people, groups of people like POC in getting access to higher biodiversity? Neela has been getting land restoration, which is great for wildlife, but there's also seeing family-owned businesses by Latino families being evicted as city politicians want to bring in a different group of people into the community.
Yeah, it's important because that whole displacement thing, and I kind of brought that up in that first point. Obviously, and I think Northeast LA is a great example. I'm not super familiar with that part of LA, but having a few friends that live there and kind of just going there, I feel like you can kind of see that. And I guess just bottom line, if there's investment in the community and there's going to be more things like parks and trees, and that's going to be good for birds. And if there's ways to do that where you can still have your mom and pop shop and the people that have been living there for a long time and have that all kind of come from the community, that's a win-win. I just don't know. It's just really hard when you're thinking about all these crazy market forces that go into, house values and people getting pushed out. And it's kind of beyond what I'm aware of, I think, and what I can answer, but it's a good thing to think of.
Yeah, there is a paper folks are probably familiar with. It's the title of which is Just Green Enough, the idea of designing interventions so that they don't actually result in displacement. Because I don't, at least those of us who are working on the conservation side is certainly not our our intent. Um, and of course have to think through the implications of the things that are being advocated. So we appreciate that comment a lot.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you.
Alicia, and this I think is related. Alicia says, I'm sure it's obvious, but it's a status symbol to hire a landscape architect. Emily says, did you measure the air temperature at these sites? If so, did it correlate at all with forest or urban bird distribution?
We didn't, but I would be shocked if that in a similar area of, say, the San Gabriel Valley, like say you're in San Marino and then you just go a couple miles even south and you're on Valley Boulevard where there's no trees, it would be totally different temperatures in those locations based on like the amount of green vegetation, all that, and the albedo and everything, you know, on a place like. And so that's actually an important point. I think what's really kind of intriguing with looking at these things like land value and what that means is that's correlated with so many things that could actually be the driving force. And I think that gets back at you know, these interesting experiments that you could do to try to isolate exactly what it is. That's like, yeah, maybe some of those birds like, it's too dang hot down there, I'm not going there. My background or my kind of thing that I'm always thinking about, I'm a kind of a food web guy, and so I'm always thinking about what birds are eating. And so if there's no food for them, they're just not going to be there. And for a lot of these species, they have to have those, like, you know, like a coast live oak that's going to be loaded with caterpillars that they're gonna get, or acorns or whatever it is. So important to think about temperature. We didn't measure it. There's certainly some studies. There's a cool study from Brian Brown and Terry McGlynn looking at insect diversity in the city, and it definitely correlates with temperature, but then that probably correlates with a bunch of other things. So teasing all that stuff apart is hard.
Yeah. Great last question here from Ryan. Can the public read drafts or see pieces of the research from the paper you're working on now?
Well, I've been telling Travis this thing is about done for about 7 months, and things like having a baby, which we did last fall, come into play. So we're basically stay tuned. I'm not one to, we can't share this until it's published, but there are ways that people can, I guess, like, I don't know, those like bioarchive type things, you know, preprints. I think you're just going to have to wait till it's published, and hopefully that'll be not too far off in the future. But thank you. I need the pressure.
Wonderful. Yeah, exactly. So what I'm going to do now is thank everybody and end the broadcast of the meeting here. Again, this is Los Angeles Audubon. We've got our website in the chat there. Those of you who are new to us and are interested in birds and conservation and education around birds can get on our mailing list at LAAudubon, AUDUBON.org. And I just want to thank Eric again for presenting, and all of you for the really engaging conversation and discussion. So thank you so much.